I'm Lila Henderson, 29 years old, and 3 days ago, my father did something I never believed a son could do. He flew my grandfather Henry, the man who built an entire shipping empire, from a single pier to Lisbon, and he left him there. No passport, no phone, not even a wallet. Just the Atlantic wind at his back, and a promise my father never intended to keep. When I heard what had happened, I realized that love, loyalty, and inheritance were about to collide in ways none of us were ready for. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to watch someone you love get hurt by their own family. I grew up in Seattle in a house that smelled like salt air and fresh-cut wood. My grandfather Henry started Henderson Maritime before I was born. He liked to say he could still feel the sway of the first tugboat he ever bought, and that work not luck was the only true compass in life. My grandmother passed when I was little, so most of my childhood memories are of him sitting on the porch polishing his old compass and telling me stories about storms that tested his crew's courage. My father Martin listened to those stories with a polite smile, the kind of smile that hid more envy than admiration. He admired the power, but not the patience it took to earn it. When I was a kid, we all lived under the same roof. 3 generations under one roof sounded like tradition, but it often felt like tension simmering just below the surface. Grandpa valued modesty and hard work. Dad valued image and influence. I saw it in the way they dressed Grandpa's worn wool sweaters against Dad's imported suits, and in the way they spoke to the world. Grandpa believed your word was a contract. Dad believed every contract could be negotiated. After my mom died when I was 21, that difference grew into distance. Grandpa retreated into quiet dignity, and Dad began spending money faster than anyone could track. Still, Grandpa refused to give up on him. He said every man deserved a chance to find his way back. When Dad suggested taking him to Portugal one last trip before we redo your study, "Pop, I wanted to believe it was an act of love." Lisbon had always been on Grandpa's list, a place he called the mirror of old ports, where sea and sky blur together. He trusted too easily, maybe because he wanted to. I joined them for part of the journey, mostly to keep an eye on things, though I never said that out loud. Dad had a way of making suspicion feel like betrayal. At the airport, he was all charm. He chatted with gate agents, slipped through lines, and winked at me like everything was under control. "You'll love Lisbon," he said. "Blue tiles, fresh sardines, and no paperwork." I smiled back, but the truth sat heavy in my stomach. My father's winks had once meant reassurance. Now they meant strategy. During the flight, Grandpa napped with his hat tilted over his eyes while I scrolled through messages from my best friend Claire, a young attorney at a firm downtown. I told her I had a bad feeling. She told me to stop worrying. "No one steals from a man with a paper trail," she wrote. I wanted to believe that. Lisbon was stunning, the cobblestones, still wet from rain trams, clanging through narrow streets, the smell of ocean and pastry everywhere. Grandpa came alive there. He told stories about hauling rope when he was 14 and playing chess with dockhands who taught him patience by betting bottle caps instead of coins. Dad laughed in all the right places, ordered the best wine, and offered to hold the passports so Pop doesn't lose them. It looked like a family trip, but under the laughter was something brittle. On the 3rd day, we visited the Belém Tower. The light off the water was so bright it felt like another world. Dad suggested a detour. He said Grandpa needed a nap and told me to pick up pastries nearby. I hesitated, but Grandpa squeezed my hand and said, "Go on, kiddo. Bring 3. I walked toward the bakery, thinking about which flavor he'd like best. When I came back, the concierge looked uneasy. The hotel room had been checked out. Grandpa's name erased his belongings, gone. My calls went straight to voicemail. I sat on the stone steps outside, counting breaths just to keep from shaking. 10 in, 10 out. My grandfather, the man who once crossed oceans with a broken radio, was stranded somewhere in a foreign city because his own son decided it was convenient. I knew what my family would call me if I acted. Meddling. That was their word for standing up when something was wrong. But Grandpa always called it backbone. By the time the police report was filed and the U.S. consulate took my statement, I hadn't slept in 30 hours. Under the fluorescent lights of a small interview room, a woman named Patricia looked at me carefully and asked, "Has your father ever tried to take your grandfather's assets?" before I wanted to say no. Instead, Nothing came out. That silence was my answer, and it changed everything. When the emergency passport was ready, Patricia slid a second envelope across the desk. "He asked us to give you this when you came." Inside was a note in my grandfather's blocky handwriting. Just 2 words, "Olive Branch." Under it another line, "Follow the list. Keep your voice calm." I didn't know it then, but that note was the start of the reckoning. Grandpa hadn't just anticipated betrayal, he had prepared for it. And by the time my father landed back in Seattle, certain he'd inherited everything, I was already on my way home with a plan that would expose what he'd done and decide once and for all which kind of legacy our family would live by. The hotel lobby in Lisbon felt too bright, too clean, and too silent. I stood there with a paper bag of pastries cooling in my hands, waiting for the concierge to say something that would make sense. Instead, his smile tightened, and he told me the room had been checked out an hour ago. No forwarding note, no luggage, and the passports were gone. My father's charm had slipped quietly into cruelty, and the proof was standing right in front of me. At first I thought there had to be a mistake. Maybe Grandpa had felt ill and gone to a clinic, or maybe the front desk mixed up names. But when my father's phone went straight to voicemail again and again, that small hope collapsed. I sat on the cold stone steps outside the hotel, the Atlantic air cutting through my jacket. Around me, Lisbon moved like normal cars, passing voices, rising tourists laughing. But my world had narrowed to a single impossible fact. My grandfather was gone, and my father had taken everything that tied him to home. I remember counting my breaths the way Grandpa taught me when I was little. 10 and 10 out. When you panic, he used to say the sea doesn't care. You breathe, you move, you fix what you can. So I moved. I went to the police first, showing them a photo of Grandpa smiling beside the harbor. They asked questions I couldn't answer. When was the last time I saw him? Did he have health problems? Could he have wandered off? I filled out the report anyway, clinging to procedure because it was the only thing that felt solid. By evening, I was sitting in a small, fluorescent-lit office at the U.S. consulate, my palms damp against the table. A woman in a navy blazer introduced herself as Patricia Bell. She spoke with the kind of calm that only comes from seeing too many strange emergencies. She asked for every detail I could remember: the passport handoff, the flight itinerary, the last words my father had said. When I got to the part about the detour, her pen paused over the page. Then she looked up, her voice gentle but firm. "Has your father ever tried to take your grandfather's assets before?" The question hung there between us, heavier than the air. I wanted to say no, to defend the man who used to carry me on his shoulders at Mariners games, but the truth pressed harder, and all I could do was shake my head, because silence was easier than lying. Patricia didn't push. She just slid me a cup of water and said, "We'll issue an emergency passport for your grandfather. In the meantime, stay reachable. He may make contact." Her tone said she didn't expect him to. Hours later, a clerk returned with an envelope, one for Grandpa, and to my surprise, one for me. Patricia handed it over like it was something sacred. "He left this with us," she said quietly. My name was written in his careful block letters, Lila Olive Branch. Inside a short note, "Follow the list. Keep your voice calm." I didn't understand what that meant until I called Claire on speaker, pacing through the narrow streets as the city woke around me. "He left me something called Blue Harbor," I said. "Do you know what that is?" There was a long pause before her voice came through low and measured. "Lila, that's the encrypted folder your grandfather sent me 2 months ago. I thought it was related to a contract dispute. Should I open it?" I told her yes. The next sounds I heard were keystrokes, then a soft breath. "Oh my God," she whispered. "He knew, Lila. He knew exactly what your father was planning." She told me the folder held meeting recordings, emails, and spreadsheets, proof that my father had been preparing to transfer properties and liquidate assets under the guise of a gift. There was even a memo outlining potential charges if Grandpa were moved across borders without consent. "Your grandfather called it a tripwire," Claire said. "If Martin ever tried to isolate him, I was supposed to contact a federal prosecutor named Alyssa Hayes." I stopped walking. The sky was starting to lighten the tiled walls, catching pale pink reflections from the sunrise. "Why would he make me part of this?" I asked. Claire hesitated. Because he wanted you to make the choice yourself. He trusted you to do what was right, not what was easy. By the time I reached my hotel, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number labeled Pearl. 3 words: land, swap cars, garden. Then another: he'll try the front first. Leave the door on latch. Recording on. I stared at the screen, unsure whether to feel terrified or relieved. Somehow Grandpa had already arranged his own way home. And somehow he was giving me instructions, as if he knew exactly how this would play out. The next day was a blur of flights connections and coffee that tasted like metal. Claire stayed on the phone until I boarded, walking me through what to say if anyone asked questions at customs. I clutched Grandpa's note the entire time, its edges softening from my fingers. Halfway over the Atlantic, I read through the rest of the Blue Harbor files, his diary entries, audio clips, and emails. Each one was precise, deliberate, and painfully clear. He had seen through my father months ago and built a paper trail strong enough to survive betrayal. Somewhere over Greenland, another text came from Pearl. Just one line, Justice, that's also mercy. The hardest kind. I didn't know whether to cry or laugh. Grandpa was alive, planning something far beyond my understanding, and I was about to walk straight into it. When I landed back in Seattle, the rain was waiting for me. It hit the pavement in fine, cold sheets smelling like salt and cedar. A driver from Grandpa's security firm was standing at the curb with my name on a placard. "Mr. Henderson is home," he said simply. The words didn't register at first. "Home," I repeated. He nodded. "Arrived late last night." By the time we turned onto the brick drive of the Bellevue mansion, my hands were shaking. The camellias along the walkway were still blooming, their pink petals scattered like confetti against the wet stone. Inside, Grandpa stood by the staircase in his navy cardigan, looking every bit as steady as I remembered. When he saw me, he smiled and tapped his cane once on the marble. "There's my girl," he said. "Did Patricia give you my note?" I nodded, trying to breathe. "She did." "I thought you—" He raised a hand before I could finish. "We'll talk about that later. For now, we have 20 minutes before your father gets here. Security cameras are already live. Claire's firm sent a technician to route everything to a private cloud. The locks have been changed." He spoke with the quiet precision of a man used to storms. My heart was pounding, but his calm steadied me. "What are we doing, Grandpa?" I asked. "Waiting," he said, turning toward the front hall. "And when he walks through that door, you'll see what justice looks like when it comes home." The sound of tires on wet gravel echoed through the rain. A silver BMW rolled to a stop at the gate. My father stepped out first, coat immaculate, face unreadable. A second later, my Aunt Evelyn climbed from the passenger seat, her smile sharp as a blade. Grandpa's cane tapped once more against the floor, and he looked at me with a glint that almost looked like peace. "Stay calm, Lila," he murmured. "Let him open the door." And as the front knob began to turn, I understood that the moment we'd been circling our whole lives had finally arrived. The front door opened, and my father froze in the entryway. Rain beaded on his coat, and behind him stood my Aunt Evelyn, her perfume trailing into the foyer like smoke. For a long moment, no one spoke. My grandfather leaned on his cane, his face calm, his voice steady. "Welcome home," he said. "We've been expecting you." My father blinked the shock clear before he masked it with a practiced smile. "Dad, thank God you're safe. We were worried sick." His voice caught on the lie, but he pushed through it, stepping forward as if nothing had happened. I stood beside Grandpa, keeping my phone angled just enough for the small red recording light to catch the marble floor. "I have a surprise for you," Grandpa said. The words landed between us like a warning. My father's eyes narrowed. A surprise, he repeated, his tone polite but strained. "I thought you'd be resting after the trip. That's what you told the hotel staff," I said quietly. He turned toward me, and the warmth in his expression vanished. "Lila," he said, his voice dipping lower, "this is a family matter. You don't need to involve yourself in things you don't understand." Grandpa's cane tapped once against the marble. "She understands enough," he said. "More than you think." Evelyn crossed her arms, her diamond bracelet catching the light. "Honestly, Henry, this is getting out of hand. Martin's been through enough. Let's all just sit down," and Grandpa cut her off with a look that silenced even her polished tone. "We'll sit when the truth does." His gaze shifted toward me. "Lila, would you hand me the folder on the table, please?" I placed it beside him, a neat stack of papers bound under a silver tugboat paperweight. Grandpa gestured toward it. "Your father's surprise," he said. "Go ahead, Martin. Read." Dad's jaw flexed as he flipped through the first page's motions to invalidate a fraudulent deed, evidence of bank correspondence and valuations of the Bellevue property dated weeks before their Lisbon trip. His face drained of color. Evelyn stepped closer to peek, her lipstick tightening. "What is this?" she asked. I kept my tone level. "Records of your emails and phone calls with 3 realtors. Claire helped me compile them this morning. You went through my private," Dad started, but Grandpa's voice cut clean through his protest. "You left me in another country without a passport, son. Privacy is no longer your currency." For a few seconds, the only sound was the rain against the windows. Then a new voice came from behind us. "Mr. Henderson." A woman in a dark coat stepped inside, flashing identification. "Alyssa Hayes, Assistant U.S. Attorney. We're here to collect preliminary statements." 2 other officials followed, a detective and a technician carrying a small case. Evelyn's face went pale. "You brought the government into this," she hissed. "They were already aware," Grandpa said. "All we did was keep the appointment." Alyssa's tone was calm, almost courteous. "No arrests today," she said. "We're here to preserve evidence." She nodded toward my phone. "Ms. Henderson, if you'll continue recording, we'll catalog as we go." Dad's shoulders tensed. "You have no proof," he said. Alyssa raised an eyebrow. "That's what we're here to confirm." She motioned for the technician to set up on the study desk. The detective unzipped the case and began placing evidence bags beside the printer. Grandpa moved slowly to the study, his steps deliberate. He pointed to a hard drive labeled Harbor Cut. "That's what you're looking for," he said. Alyssa's assistant connected it to a laptop. The screen flickered to life. Starbucks background noise, the hiss of steamed milk, and my father's voice saying, "It's just a medical update, standard paperwork. Sign here, Pop." Then the faint sound of cash counting out $300. Evelyn's composure broke first. "Martin," she whispered. My father glared at her, the facade cracking. Alyssa kept her voice neutral. "Time-stamped, logged, and notarized off-site for cash," she said. "We'll take custody of the original device." I didn't feel satisfaction, just a quiet heaviness. Dad had always been the man who could talk anyone into anything, but no words were left to twist. When the agents finished cataloging, Alyssa turned to Grandpa. "We'll proceed with your counsel tomorrow. For now, these findings will remain under seal." She handed him an envelope. "Your attorney requested this be delivered personally." Grandpa took it, his hand steady. He opened it, slowly scanned the first few lines, then slid it across the table toward my father. "It's done," he said softly. Dad looked down, his brow furrowed. "What's this?" "It's an irrevocable charitable trust," Grandpa said. "The house, the cabin, the marina shares, they now belong to the Henderson Foundation for Maritime Scholarships. I retain a life estate. When I'm gone, Lila will serve as trustee." Evelyn gasped, then caught herself. My father's hands trembled around the envelope. "You'd give everything to strangers before your own blood." Grandpa's eyes softened the way the tide softens before pulling back. "They won't abandon me in a foreign country," he said quietly. "And they'll remember who built the docks they stand on." The silence that followed felt endless. Then Alyssa closed her briefcase and nodded. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Henderson," she said to Grandpa about next steps. She gave me a brief understanding look before she left. When the door shut behind them, Dad's voice dropped low. "You think this makes you noble?" "No," I said. "It makes me responsible." His smile twisted. "Then be responsible for the fallout." He turned sharply, brushing past Evelyn, and the front door slammed hard enough to rattle the chandelier. The echo carried down the hall like thunder. For a long time after no one spoke, the house seemed to exhale all at once, like it had been holding its breath through years of tension. Grandpa leaned back in his chair, shoulders sinking. "You did well," he said, calm voice, steady hand. "That's how storms pass." I nodded, though my chest still felt tight. Outside, the rain softened to a mist, and the sound of it against the glass felt almost like peace. Grandpa stood and walked slowly toward the kitchen. "Come on," he said. "You need something warm." While the kettle boiled, I noticed his hands older, thinner, but still certain. "Do you regret any of it?" I asked. He paused, stirring sugar into his cup. "Only that I waited so long to let you see the truth for yourself." The fire in the hearth crackled softly. Somewhere down the drive, the BMW engine started and faded into the distance. We listened until the sound was gone. Then Grandpa said, "This isn't over, Lila. People like your father don't lose quietly." I knew he was right. The look my father gave me before he left wasn't anger, it was a promise, and whatever storm he planned next, it was already forming beyond the rain. The next morning, the house felt like a harbor after a storm quiet, but carrying the weight of what had passed. I found Grandpa in the kitchen already dressed and stirring oatmeal as if nothing extraordinary had happened the night before. He greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We have work to do," he said. "Calm work." I joined him at the table, and we spread out papers across the old oak surface. Each document from the Blue Harbor Drive was printed, tabbed, and labeled. Claire had stayed up most of the night uploading everything to a secure server. The recordings, emails, and notarized pages all told the same story, one my grandfather had quietly built piece by piece while pretending not to see what his son was becoming. Later that day, Margaret Chen arrived. She was smaller than I expected, soft-spoken, but with a steadiness that filled the room. Her gray suit was simple, her hair neatly pinned back. She shook Grandpa's hand, then mine, and said, "We're not asking for damages, Mr. Henderson. We're asking for certainty." That line seemed to ease something in him. By afternoon, the guest room had turned into a kind of command post. Timelines hung on foam boards, receipts were slipped into sleeves, and the Blue Harbor files sat at the center of it all. Grandpa handled the logistics with quiet focus, though I caught him wincing once as he straightened a pile of papers. "You should rest," I said. He waved me off. "Rest is for people with time to waste. We're building clarity, not comfort." Outside, Seattle's winter light fell gray over the bay. I sat by the window remembering the moment in Lisbon when Patricia had asked about my father's history. I hadn't realized then how deep his debts ran loans tied to real estate deals, missing funds from old accounts, and the property valuations timed perfectly with the deed transfer. It was all there in Blue Harbor, neatly documented and dated. When Claire came by with takeout, she carried more than food. "The court filings are ready," she said. "Margaret wants to file first thing tomorrow. Temporary restraining order, full motion for fraud and undue influence." She set down the folders, then added softly, "Your dad hired Robert Michaels." I recognized the name immediately, a lawyer known for his theatrics and love of Latin phrases. It meant Dad wasn't going to settle quietly. That night, Grandpa and I ate in the study. He'd made soup too salty, but warm. Between spoonfuls, he spoke like a man teaching one last lesson. "Money doesn't make a man decent," he said. "It just makes him louder." He looked at me over his glasses. "Do you regret any of this?" I asked. He stirred his soup. "No. I regret not teaching your father the difference between inheritance and legacy. I wrote that down in my notebook before bed, knowing I'd want to remember it later." When the hearing date came, I felt the shift before we even entered the courthouse. The air was heavy with perfume and anticipation. Margaret carried a leather folder under her arm and walked with quiet authority. Grandpa looked smaller than usual, but composed his navy tie perfectly centered. We sat in the front row, our side a calm sea of blue and gray. Across the aisle, my father sat with Evelyn and Michaels, who seemed to enjoy the attention of the room. When the judge entered Honorable Patricia Morrison, the shuffle of movement stopped. Michaels began first, his voice smooth and theatrical. He painted Grandpa as a confused old man, manipulated by a granddaughter with outsized influence. He waved his hands toward me, but didn't look directly at my face. "The trust," he said, "is an end run around filial duty, a selfish act disguised as generosity." When it was Margaret's turn, she didn't raise her voice. She spoke with deliberate calm. "A deed procured by deceit is not a deed," she said. "The evidence shows misrepresentation, improper notarization, and an international abandonment designed to gain possession." Each word landed like a drop of steady rain. "This is not melodrama," she continued. "It is pattern." She called Sloane, first the notary. He fidgeted in the witness chair, eyes darting toward the gallery. Under oath, his story wavered. He admitted that Dad had described Grandpa as mobility impaired and had paid him $300 in cash, 10 times his normal rate for an off-site job. Margaret didn't smile or raise her voice. "Thank you," she said simply and stepped back. When it was my turn, the oath felt heavier than I expected. I walked the court through Lisbon, through the concierge's expression, through Patricia Bell's quiet question in that fluorescent office. Margaret asked what it felt like when I first opened Blue Harbor. I paused, thinking of the sound Claire made over the phone, the soft exhale of realization. It felt like clarity, I said, like someone had left a light on in a dark room. Michaels tried to twist my testimony, suggesting I disliked my father. "I love him," I said. The words came out even though my throat tightened. "That's why it hurts." He pressed again. "And yet you invited federal authorities into your family matter." I nodded. I honored my grandfather's instruction. I made a report when I believed a crime had occurred. Margaret had told me to stay calm, and I did. Every time my father's gaze tried to pull me off balance, I remembered Grandpa's words, calm voice, steady hand. Then my father took the stand. Michaels shifted his tone to something softer. "Mr. Henderson, why Lisbon?" he asked. Dad's voice carried that familiar blend of charm and justification. "He loves the ocean," he said. "I wanted to give him memories before it was too late." When Margaret stood for cross-examination, the air changed. "Mr. Henderson," she began. "Which came first, the valuation emails to the realtors or the deed transfer? You call a gift." My father hesitated. "I don't recall." Margaret lifted a single page. "Exhibit D shows your email request to Sable Realty, dated March 3rd. The deed is dated March 26th. Is that correct?" His throat bobbed. "Yes." She moved closer, her tone low. "And you told the notary your father had mobility issues. That was a misunderstanding." Margaret laid another document on the rail. "And in Lisbon, she asked who held your father's passport." He shifted in his chair. "I did." She paused just long enough for the silence to settle. "And when you left the hotel?" He swallowed hard. "Still me." The courtroom felt smaller in that moment. Even Michaels couldn't find footing. The judge leaned forward slightly, her hands folded. When the closing arguments ended, she spoke without hesitation. "This court finds the deed void for fraud and undue influence. Possession remains with Mr. Henry Henderson." Her gaze softened as she looked at Grandpa. "As to the trust absent any evidence of incapacity or coercion, the court sees a valid charitable instrument. Arguments about filial duty belong at dinner tables, not in equity." The gavel struck once, and the sound echoed like a dock line snapping taut. My father's jaw clenched, but he didn't look at me as he left. Evelyn followed her heels, clicking sharp against the floor. Grandpa exhaled slowly beside me, as if he'd been holding his breath for years. Margaret closed her folder and nodded once. "That's the law," she said quietly. "But law is only the first step." As we walked out into the rain, the courthouse steps glistened under the gray light. Grandpa leaned on my arm, his voice almost a whisper. "You did well," he said, "but this isn't the end. The hardest part comes after the verdict." I didn't know then what he meant, but I would soon. Because in his study that night, he handed me something that would turn everything again, a weathered ship's log bound in cracked leather. On its last page in his small, patient script was a single line: "If Martin ever tries to take what isn't his, give him the thing he thinks he wants." When we got home that evening, the air in the house felt lighter, but uncertain, like the stillness after thunder. Grandpa went straight to his study and placed the ship's log on his desk. The leather cover looked worn smooth from decades of salt and sun. "This was my first captain's book," he said, running a hand over it. "It holds the whole history of what I built and what I should have done differently." I turned to the last page, where his handwriting trailed steady and small. "If Martin ever tries to take what isn't his, give him the thing he thinks he wants." I looked up. "What does that mean?" Grandpa smiled faintly. "It means your father doesn't know the weight of work. Maybe it's time he learns." The next morning, we drove to Henderson Maritime Headquarters. The building sat near the waterfront, its glass walls reflecting cranes and ships in motion. Grandpa's staff had worked there for years, people who had started on the docks and climbed through sheer grit. When we entered, they greeted him like a captain returning to port. I hadn't realized how much they loved him until then. Inside the boardroom, the air was thick with sea charts, ledgers, and the faint scent of engine oil that clung to everything from the docks below. Dad arrived last, his tie slightly crooked, his face carrying the smugness of a man expecting applause. "What's this?" he said. "A reunion?" Grandpa gestured toward the table where a single folder sat. "A transition," he replied. "If you want a legacy, Martin, it's time you build one." Dad laughed under his breath and sat down. "I've built plenty," he said. "You just never noticed." Grandpa pushed the folder toward him. "Then prove it. Take over the company. 6 months. Full operations. You'll be interim CEO under union supervision and compliance oversight. Salary included." Dad froze halfway through his smirk. "You're serious," he said. "Completely." Grandpa leaned back, his tone calm. "You always wanted control. Now you have it." I watched his eyes flicker between disbelief and pride. "You made it sound like punishment," he said. Grandpa's voice softened. "It's mercy, the kind that asks you to stand where other men work." For a moment, Dad didn't speak. Then he pulled the folder toward him and scanned the pages. His jaw tightened as he reached the section outlining the oversight terms: union mentor, financial transparency, ethics audits, and performance reviews. "You made this look bad," he muttered. "It is hard," Grandpa said. "It always was." He pushed the papers aside and stood. "I won't be tested like a child." Grandpa's eyes met his. "Then stop acting like one." The room went silent, except for the faint hum of the heating vent. Finally, Dad exhaled and sat down again. "Fine," he said. 6 months. You'll see what I can do." When we left the building, the sky was a dull slate gray over the bay. Grandpa said nothing on the ride home. The rain hit the windshield in steady rhythm, and I knew he was thinking not of victory, but of the long work ahead. The first months passed slowly. Dad took the job, though he treated it at first like a punishment more than an opportunity. I saw his name appear in company emails at first, with mistakes, then fewer. He argued with the union mentor, an old mariner named Frank Weller, who had been with Henderson Maritime for 40 years. Frank didn't bend. He showed up at dawn, made Dad walk the docks, taught him about maintenance schedules, compliance inspections, and the 1,000 small details that kept a fleet alive. By March, something began to shift. I noticed it in the way Dad spoke during the few company updates that reached me: less performance, more substance. He paid down 2 credit cards. He stopped taking the long lunches at expensive restaurants. He didn't call me, but I heard from Claire that he was working 10-hour days and showing up to meetings sober. Grandpa listened quietly when I told him. "Weather changes," he said, "but you still reef the sails until you're sure." Spring came, and with it the company's quarterly review. The board noted improvements in safety compliance and lower maintenance overruns. Grandpa stayed out of it completely, insisting the process was Dad's to face. If he fails, he said he'll know it's his failure. If he succeeds, he'll know how it feels to earn it. The next time I saw Dad was on Thanksgiving morning. The rain had returned softer now, coating the driveway in a mist that smelled of cedar and salt. When the bell rang, Grandpa looked up from the kitchen table and said, "Go ahead, answer it." I opened the door, and there he was. My father stood on the porch, holding a folder under one arm and a knit cap in his hand. He looked older, as though the months had taken some of the polish off him and replaced it with something real. "I can't undo Lisbon," he said quietly, "but I can try to be a man Grandpa would hire." Behind me, Grandpa leaned on his cane, studying him. "You burned the bridge," he said, "but you can still cross it, just not standing tall." Dad nodded once, understood. The silence that followed was strange, not warm, but not hostile either. I stepped aside, and for the first time since that morning in Lisbon, my father walked into the house without a smirk or an excuse. Grandpa motioned toward the study. "Let's see what 6 months of weather has taught you." They talked for a long time while I made tea and pretended not to listen. Their voices rose once or twice, then fell again. When they came out, Grandpa's face was tired but peaceful. "He's learning," he said simply. In the weeks that followed, I watched small things change. Dad still carried guilt, but it was quieter now, shaped more like work than shame. He volunteered to oversee a safety initiative at the docks. He made restitution payments to the household staff whose hours he'd once cut. Claire said the prosecutor, Alyssa Hayes, had offered him a pre-charge diversion program, 6 months of verified service, and donations to the Maritime Scholarship Fund in exchange for full closure. Grandpa called it justice that bends toward mercy. One gray Tuesday afternoon, we sat by the fire, the house filled with the smell of pine and lemon polish. Grandpa poured tea into 2 mugs and handed me one. "What did you become today, Olive?" he asked, using the name only he called me. I looked toward the window where the rain streaked down like thin silver threads. "Someone who can forgive without forgetting," I said. He nodded, pleased. "That's legacy," he whispered. Just as he spoke, headlights swept across the front lawn. A car door closed outside. When I opened the door, my father stood there again, the same cap in his hands. "I heard about the scholarships," he said. "I'm here to write a check." Grandpa smiled faintly from behind me. "Write it to work," he said. "Not to us." Dad nodded. "That's all I've been writing lately." This time when I stepped aside, he didn't hesitate. The house seemed to take a deep breath, as if finally exhaling months of storm air. We weren't healed, not yet, but the tide had turned. The same house that once held silence now held the sound of 3 people learning how to begin again. The months that followed moved like the tide, slow, steady, and full of hidden currents. Winter came early that year. I'd walk into Grandpa's study in the mornings and find him surrounded by stacks of paperwork, his reading glasses perched low, the fire burning beside him. The Blue Harbor files were now archived, neatly locked in a drawer. Yet they seemed to linger in the air, like the faint hum of a ship's engine long after it's shut down. Dad's 6-month leadership trial had stretched him thinner than I'd ever seen. Word from the docks was mixed. Some said he was learning, others said he was stumbling. Frank Weller kept his reports factual solid, where they could be firm where they needed to be. "He shows up early," he told Grandpa once. "Still forgets the human part sometimes, but he's trying." Grandpa only nodded. "The sea has a way of sanding the rough edges off a man," he said quietly. One afternoon in February, a letter from the prosecutor's office arrived, addressed to both Grandpa and me. Alyssa Hayes had reviewed the evidence collected from Lisbon and the Seattle property filings. Her tone was professional, but not cold. "Pending full restitution and continued compliance, no criminal charges will be filed. Federal involvement will remain in observation only." I read the last line twice, the relief feeling less like victory and more like exhaling after months underwater. That evening, Grandpa and I sat at the kitchen table, tea cooling beside us. "Justice isn't always punishment," he said. "Sometimes it's the chance to live right after doing wrong." I wasn't sure if he meant my father or himself, but either way, I understood. The next morning, Claire arrived with another update. "Your father's attorney filed for a motion to amend the trust," she said. "They're arguing emotional coercion. Margaret's preparing the response." I looked up from the papers. "He's still fighting it." She sighed. "He's still learning what surrender looks like." Court reconvened the following week. The old wood-paneled room felt familiar now, the faint smell of varnish and cold air from the windows. Judge Morrison presided again, patient but firm. My father looked better than he had in months. His suit pressed his expression calmer. Still, I saw the wear beneath his eyes. Aunt Evelyn sat 2 rows behind him, all in pale gray, her hands tight around her clutch. Margaret's team moved smoothly. The trust stood untouched. The judge upheld the prior ruling and denied my father's amendment. But what lingered wasn't the outcome, it was the look on Dad's face afterward. He didn't rage or argue this time. He just sat there as if finally realizing that the inheritance he'd chased had already turned into something else. Outside, the day had turned gray and cold. Reporters waited near the courthouse steps, but Margaret ushered us quietly through the side exit. Grandpa leaned on his cane, his coat collar turned up against the wind. "Let him go his way," he said softly. "It's the only way back." Weeks passed before we heard from Dad again. When his name finally appeared on the company schedule for a quarterly audit meeting, Grandpa asked me to attend with him. Henderson Maritime looked different now. Cleaner systems, stricter oversight. Dad's office was smaller than the one he'd taken over months earlier, but it felt earned. He stood when we entered, his voice steady. "Mr. Weller says I passed inspection." Grandpa smiled faintly. Mr. Weller's never been one for false praise. They went over performance charts and safety reports. Dad spoke clearly with the same quiet tone I remembered from Grandpa during his prime. When it was done, Grandpa reached into his coat and handed him a folder. The prosecutor's office agreed to a pre-charge diversion, he said. 6 months of continued service, documented restitution, and a donation to the Maritime Scholarship Fund. Once it's complete, your record will close. Dad looked at the folder, his hand trembling slightly. "You did this?" Grandpa shook his head. "You earned it." For a long time, none of us spoke. Then Dad nodded once. "Thank you," he said. Spring came late that year. The company docks smelled of diesel and rain, the cranes swaying over the water like tired giants. I went down there once to meet Frank, who was finishing a shift. He told me about my father's progress, how he'd learned to listen, how he'd helped settle a labor dispute without threats or shortcuts. "He's still green," Frank said, "but he's not the same man who showed up in December." At home, Grandpa was getting weaker. His walks grew shorter, his voice softer. But his mind was still sharp as the salt wind. We'd sit together on the back porch with blankets over our knees, watching the gulls ride the current. "Do you know what I'm proudest of, Olive?" he asked one evening. "That we didn't let anger decide the ending. The sea forgives even when it doesn't forget." A few days later, Alyssa called again to confirm the program's terms. My father would serve out the remainder of his compliance period under company supervision, making full restitution to the house staff and contributing a set amount each quarter to the Henderson Foundation. "We prefer redemption to trophies," she said. It sounded like something Grandpa might have written himself. By early summer, the changes around us felt quieter, less like headlines and more like weather, gradual, invisible, but real. The company's finances stabilized. The scholarship fund began receiving applications. Grandpa's name appeared in the trade journals again, this time not for scandal, but for philanthropy. One Sunday afternoon, while trimming roses in the garden, Grandpa called me over. "Look at this," he said, holding up a single bloom, its petals bruised but still open. "It's not perfect, but it's alive." He smiled at it for a moment before setting the shears down. "That's what I wanted for him, for you, for this family." That night over dinner, the phone rang. It was Dad. His voice sounded unsure. "I heard about the scholarships," he said. "I'd like to contribute." Grandpa nodded when I relayed the message. "Tell him he knows where to send the check," he said, "and tell him we'll see him soon." The next evening, Dad came by in person. He stood at the same door where he'd once left with anger in his eyes. This time, he carried no papers, no plans. Only the smell of sea air and engine grease clung to him. "I've been working at the docks again," he said quietly. "Thought it might remind me what this all was supposed to mean." Grandpa nodded. "Then you finally understood the work that built you." When he stepped inside, the house felt different, lighter, somehow steadier. The walls that had held years of disappointment seemed to breathe again. I watched as my father and grandfather sat together in the study, two men linked not by perfection, but by effort. Outside, the rain returned soft and rhythmic against the windows. Grandpa looked over at me and smiled. "Storm's easing," he said. "Time to set a new course." I didn't know where that course would lead, but for the first time in years, the direction felt right. By midsummer, the waterfront had settled into its steady rhythm again. The air smelled of diesel and salt, the cranes moving against a pale sky like slow metronomes. Henderson Maritime had survived the scandal, the trial, and the turnover. Now it was breathing again, barely, but enough to stay afloat. Grandpa called it the quiet part of a storm, the pause when you wait to see what's still standing. Dad had finished his diversion program. The compliance monitor signed off with a note about substantial progress. His donations to the Maritime Scholarship Fund were consistent, and the restitution payments to the house staff were nearly complete. Still, there was a heaviness about him, a kind of humility that seemed to sit where pride used to live. One evening, Grandpa and I sat in the den reviewing new scholarship applications. The fireplace was cold, but still carried the faint scent of wood smoke. He was slower now, his hands tremoring slightly as he turned each page. "These kids remind me of myself," he said softly. "All grit, no safety net." He leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment. "When I built this company, I thought the work would be enough to teach him right from wrong. I see now it takes more than work. It takes witness." Later that week, a letter arrived from the prosecutor's office confirming Dad's case was closed. The conditions were met, the account settled. Pre-charge diversion completed, the document read. No further legal action. Grandpa read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it inside his journal. "That's justice," he said, though it won't feel like it to him yet. For a while, things seemed almost ordinary. Grandpa spent his mornings in the garden trimming the hedges or watching the gulls circle the bay. Dad started showing up more often, sometimes with reports, sometimes just to sit on the porch and talk about shipments or maintenance schedules. They never spoke of Lisbon. They didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't avoidance anymore. It was repair. In August, Henderson Maritime hosted its first scholarship luncheon. The event was held in the renovated dockside warehouse, now bright with banners and folding tables. Students in navy blazers and work boots mingled with crewmen and accountants. Grandpa gave a short speech leaning on his cane, his voice clear but fragile. "Legacy isn't what you leave behind," he said. "It's what you build into others." Dad stood in the back, listening quietly. When applause filled the room, he didn't clap right away, just stared at Grandpa with an expression I hadn't seen before. Maybe it was gratitude. Maybe it was grief. Afterward, we helped clean up. Dad rolled up his sleeves and started stacking chairs beside the dock hands. Grandpa watched him from a distance, his face unreadable. When we finally left, the tide was coming and the sound of water brushing against pilings soft and rhythmic. Grandpa turned to me. "You see, he's working now, not performing. That's how you tell the difference." A few days later, I found Grandpa in his study writing letters. The ship's log lay open beside him, the pages filled with his careful handwriting. "What are you working on?" I asked. He smiled without looking up. "Instructions," he said, "for when I'm not here to give them." The next morning, he didn't come down for breakfast. When I knocked, there was no answer. I found him asleep in his chair, the log resting on his lap. His face looked peaceful, the pen still between his fingers. The doctor said it was quick, a heart failure that came like sleep. The house fell silent in a way it never had before. The camellias outside bloomed early that year, their petals scattered along the path he used to walk every morning. For days, the room smelled faintly of the pipe tobacco he'd given up years ago. The funeral was small, just family, close staff, and a few old friends from the docks. Frank Weller read a short passage from an old sailor's prayer. Dad spoke next, his voice breaking halfway through. "My father taught me the difference between steering a ship and steering a life," he said. "I failed him once, maybe twice, but I hope I learned in time." When the service ended, the sound of seagulls echoed over the water like a benediction. A week later, we gathered in the study for the reading of the will. Margaret Chen handled it with her usual calm, her glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. Most of it had already been settled, the trust, the foundation, the charitable endowments. But there was one new clause. Grandpa had named both my father and me as joint trustees for the next 5 years. To steward this legacy together, the letter read, "so that work and wisdom walk side by side." Dad didn't speak for a long time after the meeting. When he finally did, his voice was quiet. "He gave me the work again," he said, "even after all that." I nodded. "He gave you mercy that feels like punishment." He smiled faintly. "Yeah, the hardest kind." The weeks that followed felt different. The mansion didn't echo anymore. It breathed. I moved some of Grandpa's files into a new office at the foundation where Claire helped organize the scholarship selections. The first group of students began their maritime training in early fall. I watched them tour the docks with the same wide-eyed wonder Grandpa once described in his stories. One evening, Dad showed up at the house with takeout containers and a box of old photographs. We sat by the fire, sorting through the images, dock openings, ship launches, Christmas dinners from years ago. He paused at one photo of Grandpa standing beside a tugboat, hand resting on my shoulder. "He saw something in you," Dad said. "Something I was too blind to see." I didn't know how to answer, so I just nodded. He leaned back, staring at the flames. "I used to think inheritance was money," he said. Now I think it's time. The time you're given to make things right. Outside, the rain began again, steady and cleansing. The house seemed to listen with us. Somewhere in that sound, the years of anger and misunderstanding began to dissolve. A few days later, Dad announced he was stepping down as interim CEO. "Frank's ready," he told me. "He's the right man for the job." I asked what he'd do next. He smiled. "Keep the docks running, maybe teach the new recruits what not to do. Maybe that's enough." The night before the Foundation's next board meeting, I sat alone in Grandpa's study. The ship's log was still there, its pages filled to the last line. At the very bottom, in his familiar hand, were 4 words written in pencil: "Keep the light steady." I traced them with my finger, thinking of the docks at night, the glow of lanterns reflected on black water, the soft rumble of engines returning home. The legacy he'd left wasn't built on steel or ships. It was in the quiet endurance of people who kept showing up, even after the storm. When I closed the book, I heard footsteps in the hall. My father's voice was soft. "Ready for tomorrow?" I nodded. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "He'd be proud of you," he said. Then, almost to himself, "Maybe of me too." As he turned to go, the light from the hall caught the photo on the mantel, Grandpa at the helm wind in his hair, eyes fixed on the horizon. And for the first time I believed the course ahead might finally hold calm water. The morning of the Foundation board meeting began with fog rolling in from the bay, soft and silver over the water. From Grandpa's study window, I could see the cranes rising like tall shadows and the ships easing through the mist. It felt fitting somehow that a day meant for new beginnings started beneath a quiet gray sky. Dad arrived early carrying coffee and a file of reports. His face looked older, but the wear suited him now. It wasn't exhaustion anymore. It was steadiness. He set the papers down beside me. "Frank says the new crews are shaping up," he said. "Even the rookies show up on time." I smiled. "You taught them well." He shook his head. "No, I just stopped cutting corners. Turns out that's most of the lesson." When the meeting began, the room filled with people Grandpa would have been proud to see: dock captains, accountants, new scholarship recipients sitting up straight in borrowed jackets. I opened the session with a few words about the Foundation's mission and the legacy we were carrying forward. But when I spoke his name, the room went still. Everyone knew what he had meant to this place, even those who'd never met him. Afterward, Dad stood to speak. "Henry Henderson taught me what real work feels like," he said quietly. "He also taught me what forgiveness looks like. I used to think I wanted control, but what I really needed was purpose." The students listened closely. Some of the old crewmen nodded. And for the first time I saw my father not as the man who'd betrayed his own blood, but as someone learning how to rebuild from the inside out. When the meeting ended, the board voted to dedicate a new training vessel to Grandpa. The ship would carry his name across the Sound, teaching young mariners how to navigate by instinct and patience. I glanced at Dad, expecting pride or maybe sorrow, but what I saw was something simpler: peace. That night, we returned home to the quiet hum of the house. The air still carried traces of Grandpa's pipe tobacco and lemon polish, the smells that had always made this place feel like the center of the world. In the study, I lit the small brass lamp on his desk and opened the ship's log one last time. The final entry remained the same 4 words written in pencil: "Keep the light steady." I understood now what he meant. It wasn't about holding on to the past or guarding what he'd built. It was about carrying the same light into whatever came next. I closed the log carefully and set it back on the shelf. When I walked into the hallway, Dad was there, coat in hand. "Heading down to the docks," he said. "They're launching the night run and someone's got to check the line weights." I followed him to the porch. The fog had lifted, leaving the stars bright over the water. "Need company?" I asked. He smiled. "Always." We stood there for a while, watching the tide pull against the pilings. Somewhere out beyond the channel, a ship's horn sounded low, steady, and sure. The same kind of sound Grandpa once said reminded him that no vessel ever truly sails alone. The house behind us glowed softly through the windows, and for the first time in years, it felt whole again. I thought of the line Grandpa used to repeat whenever life felt uncertain. You can't change the wind, but you can trim the sails. He'd been right. We hadn't changed the wind, we'd just learned how to steer through it together. As the waves lapped against the shore, I felt something like gratitude settle in my chest. Not for the money or the mansion or even the company, but for the truth. We'd fought for the kind that hurts before it heals. Grandpa's justice hadn't been vengeance. It was mercy, the kind that makes room for redemption. And maybe that was the lesson he'd wanted all along, that real legacy isn't measured in what you leave behind, but in how you teach others to carry it forward with decency, patience, and grace. Before I go any further, I'll leave you with this. If someone once hurt you, but is trying to make it right, let them try. Mercy doesn't erase the pain, but sometimes it's the only way to turn it into something good. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who might need its reminder. And if you've ever learned to forgive without forgetting, I'd love to hear how you found your way there.